We are live.
We are nervous.
Let me make sure that the stream actually goes live on YouTube first here. Okay, yeah, looks like it's taken off. All right. So usually at the beginning of one of our streams, we tend to be very we're a casual. We sometimes we don't even decide what we're going to talk about until we literally sit down 5 minutes before we go live, and this is why we're routinely super late. So usually we just kind of sit here and BS for a little bit at the beginning, but that's part of the reason why our live streams tend to go 2 or 3 hours, or sometimes four. So today we have
None of that with Mr. Deist. You'll notice I'm standing at attention. I put on a dress shirt and was going to have a tie, but none of my dress shirts fit my neck anymore. But I'm standing up at attention for Mr. Deist.
Yeah, we're very honored to be blessed by the presence of Mr. Jeff Deist today. I'm sure anybody who shows up and watches this video will know who Jeff Deist is, but for those of you who have been living under a rock, he is the president of the Mises Institute and the former chief of staff for Ron Paul when Ron Paul was a congressman. So he's a man who understands how the world works. He has experienced many different avenues or different facets of the world, and is keenly familiar with how it works. So we're going to have an interesting little conversation with him today. I made the mistake of putting COVID in the title of the stream, so we've already gotten the little badge on the bottom that declares that anything that we say is about to be considered wrongthink. So I may wind up changing the title later on, but what I called it was a liberty message for a post-COVID world. And first of all, I want to invite anybody who's watching this stream live. It came from our supporting listeners group. And so if you would like to watch a stream like this live, join us for something like this in the future, then feel free to join our supporting listeners group. We've got a Discord server. You can get there by just going to subscribestar.com/kingpilled. We're streaming this live on Tuesday. We'll be posting it out, airing it to the public on Thursday, I think. And yeah, so there's that. And then the other thing I wanted to say is just to say thank you to the sponsor for this stream, which is PalomaVerdeCBD.com. Paloma Verde CBD is our favorite CBD company. They're good friends of ours, personal friends. Carlos and Vanessa are very good people, and it's a family-owned business that we're happy to support, and we're glad that they support us. So if you want to take advantage of that, just go to PalomaVerdeCBD.com and enter promo code KING, and you'll get 25% off any order over $75. Okay, so just before we went live here, we were kind of having a conversation about just to kind of make sure that we're more or less on the same page with the way that we see the world, and it seemed like we do. It seems like we're very much on the same page, and there's this word that I even hesitated to put in the title today, which was not the word COVID. It was the word liberty. It's a word that I've started like checking myself when I want to go use it in a sentence, because it seems so squishy, and it's something that kind of everybody seems to use it like thinking we're all talking about the same thing, but we very clearly aren't. So how would you where would you go with that? Where would you take that fact that people seem to have completely different perspectives on what liberty actually is?
Well, that's for sure. I mean, our friends on the left certainly have a different conception of what the word means. I remember talking to a friend of mine, the late Kent Snyder, no longer with us. He was behind encouraging Ron Paul to run for president in 2008, which is a long time ago now. And I remember I was talking to Kent, and he was saying, pretty soon people are going to start putting liberty in quote marks, in scare quotes. And of course, we see that all the time now. That's abundantly true, because people on the left would argue that liberty means freedom from material wants. If you have to pay for housing or food or medical care or education, you're not really free. And this is very Marxist, because the Marxist idea is that you don't have to serve a boss, you don't have to serve a marketplace, you ought to have the material means at your disposal to at least get by, basics, so that you can develop your true self. And we're all going to be playwrights or artists or singers or something like that. But because we're all forced into this workaday world by capitalism, all these otherwise brilliant factory workers or something are being held back from their creative achievement or outcomes. I mean, can you imagine how horrible most people would be at music or poetry or acting or anything creative? I mean, it's just an absolute farce. So, I mean, you got to understand, and this is part of the morphing of liberalism from the 19th to the 20th century, and our idea of that word and that concept is a positive rights worldview. So when the left hears liberty, they very much view that through a positive rights lens. When the right hears that word, I guess they think of ordered liberty. They get tied up with Edmund Burke and this tension between the good of society and the rights of the individual, this tension between traditionalism and religion and capitalism and markets, which are, in many ways disruptive to traditionalism and religion. And then libertarians hopefully understand the word as simply the absence of state coercion, right? Liberty is what occurs when no state is using force against you. And to an anarchist, the absence of state coercion means the absence of a state altogether, because by definition, to exist, to have taxes or whatever, a state is a coercive entity, a monopoly. I think those are the basic parameters of it. But in the libertarian sphere, it has, I think, boiled over into cultural libertinism or cultural leftism, where you say, well, gee whiz, the strictures of family or religion or tradition or having a boss or a landlord, those things are kind of oppressive too. So even though that's not the government, you're still not really free if people look askance at transgenderism or something like that. And to be really free, this is the Cato reason type of thing. To be really free, you have to have a society that is, doesn't have a lot of social opprobrium. And of course, this is crazy. I mean, the whole thing that makes a lack of external governance possible is a healthy degree of internal governance, right? Which you're supposed to get from your parents. I mean, do we really walk down the street and, whenever we look at, let's say, a smaller or frailer person than us, do we really not knock them in the head and take their wallet simply because police exist and courts exist and potential prisons or fines exist? Or do we just recognize as reasonable human beings that we don't want to live in a society where everybody walking down the street is clubbing anybody weaker? I mean, I think it's probably a mixture of both. But, it's no coincidence that 150 years ago, when there were far external laws in the West, let's say, or the United States, that people had a lot more internal governance, moral compunction, whatever that is. That doesn't necessarily mean they were morally superior, although I think they mostly were. I don't know hardly anybody who's better than his or her great grandparents, for example. I mean, in every case, you're worse. I mean, let's face it, they were tougher, better, probably smarter. I mean, what they got through 8th grade is far more important than the bullshit you got through your graduate degree or whatever. So I guess in that sense, when we use the term liberty, I fall on, I guess, what we might call kind of a right libertarian axis on that. But it's a perverted term, no doubt about it.
You said just before we went live that to you the word libertarian is an adjective and not a noun. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, you have libertarian political views
Mm-hmm.
or libertarian legal views, because that's really what it is. It's a political legal theory based around the use of force. This idea that you're a libertarian, I think, is bad. That's a bad idea because that makes libertarians sort of a thing that you are off to one side, like you're a Scientologist or something, Whereas if you go down the street and there's all kinds of people on your particular block and they do, they have whatever job, you might identify them by their job. And some of them might have different hair color or eye color. Some of them, you might note just almost in passing, like, oh, they're Catholic. My wife sees them at church or something like that. And that would be an attribute of them rather than, the central defining characteristic of this person. And so having come up, I mean, I'm 54, so I came up in the 80s and 90s. So having come up through libertarianism and Ron Paul and all that, I get this, and I was certainly guilty of it myself at one time. So I guess I'm being a big fat hypocrite, but it's like I don't like people with a wholly political worldview, because that makes it sound like politics ought to be the manner by which we organize society, and it shouldn't, right? It should be individual, family, and marketplace, basically, and then intermediary institutions between us as individuals and government. So I think it's definitely an adjective. So if someone says to me personally, Jeff, are you a libertarian? I'd probably, given the maybe the corruption, certainly the evolution, but maybe even the corruption of the word semantically, I might hesitate to say yes. I might say, well, I have libertarian political views. But just like the word liberal radically shifted semantically, and also I would argue that the liberal worldview shifted from one of negative rights to positive rights from the 19th to 20th century. I think libertarian has shifted too, because again, I'm old enough to have been around when it was a bunch of like white, nerdy computer type guys, and it was all end of the IRS. I mean, it's this kind of thing. Legal marijuana was an edgy concept in the 80s and 90s, whereas today, I think what you see as the motivating or the animating force in most libertarian circles is more things like social justice or criminal justice reform, open borders, which I'm totally against. So again, it depends on how you define the word. If someone wants to define the word, and the other thing that's interesting is immigration and open borders were not some sort of libertarian litmus test 20 or 30 years ago. That's a new thing. And that reflects, I think, the cultural leftward shift of libertarianism. And so I guess I'm not caught up so much on the semantics. If someone wants to say to me, Jeff, unless you're for open borders, you're not a libertarian. Okay. Or if they want to say, or you're not libertarian on immigration. Okay. So things have shifted, I suppose. And language does change. I'm kind of a traditionalist type. And so that doesn't make me happy, but my happiness is not really the point here. The point is that language does evolve. And I think the term libertarian has evolved. So it's certainly not a broad enough term to encompass me and some people who call themselves libertarians. If it's that broad, it's meaningless.
Yeah, it's interesting that libertarian and liberal have both meanings have been updated. Both words have had their meanings updated, and they've both shifted in the same direction, which is to me a manifestation of Conquest's second law of politics, which is that any organization that's not explicitly right wing sooner or later becomes left wing. And it's interesting that there's no corollary, like that doesn't work the opposite direction. There's no force that's somehow taking left wing institutions and gradually turning them right wing. It just like there's no force present in as a major thing in society right now that does that. Yet then you have a large segment of the people within that call themselves libertarians who will say things like, well, we're neither left nor right. We're they're both equally bad. Which I put a tweet out today that said that when someone says that, you can tell that what they're doing is they're just using left and right as proxy terms for Democrat and Republican. They just have a really, really narrow sphere and really narrow a view of the world. Mm-hmm. And so I had a conversation several months back now with Pete Quinones. I went on his show and talked to him, and basically my perspective was kind of trying to bring these sorts of forces to people's attention, to say, look, there's some sort of a meta force here that's pushing our society just organically. There's something that's organically happening that's causing a shift here. And if we don't take this into consideration, then it's going to drag us with it. And I got a really loud response from that. one thing led to another, and we got called post-libertarians. Now, I feel the same way about that to a large degree as you do about libertarian, the term libertarian. I don't feel like it's something that defines me. It gives implications that I don't want. I understand that when someone says post-libertarian, they're talking about me among other people. I understand that that sentiment is meant to be directed at me. And I have a when you said that thing about it being an adjective and not a noun, I thought that's the same thing as with post-libertarian. Post-libertarian can be used as an adjective. There are people who've said post-libertarian is a moment, not a movement. But what has been your perspective on this dynamic that's happening, where it seems like there's people who are trying to say, look, your political views don't encapsulate all of you as a person. There's more to that, and these things need to be taken into consideration. Where do you sit with that?
Well, I mean, obviously the Mises Institute has never shied away from talking about God or family or culture or religion. I mean, that's part and parcel. Mises talked about that at length. Rothbard talked about that. So we don't shy away from that. When Walter Block says, well, I'm a thin libertarian, okay. The incrementalism you mentioned, and you say it's always been a one-way street. It always goes in one direction. Well, I think our left progressive friends, even our right progressive friends, would say, well, that's because it's progress, right? They'd say this is inexorable. And you reactionaries are living in the past and you can't deal with it, so it makes you uncomfortable, right? They would say that this is the reason this is happening, and the reason it only seems to go in one direction from the perspective of us troglodytes is that because that's progress and you don't like it. You like the old ways. I mean, that would be the answer there. I mean, Rothbard would say incrementalism only works for the collectivist progressives. It doesn't work for liberty. We need, bold strokes or bold events to move things more in our direction. So I certainly agree with that. Look, I can definitely tell you that with almost everyone in the libertarian sphere, broadly defined, organizations, magazines, groups, they are all wildly to the left of their actual donors and fans and readers and supporters. I mean, this is except for the Mises Institute, by the way. This is just absolutely true. Institution. Look at the LP. I mean, the LP is so wildly to the left of its membership. It's farce. So this is just true of institutions. This is just how they operate. If you go to a corporate 500 boardroom today that's selling widgets to deplorables in Arkansas, I guarantee you they are way to the left of their customers, which seems to me like a bad, unhealthy thing. But whatever. So that's true across, I think, all facets of American life. That's not just something that is part and parcel of libertarian world. I guess I'm post worrying about this. I want to say post give a.
Yep.
Because it's just, I mean, look, liberty's not an end in itself. It's not some sort of fetish. Right? It's a means to a better world. We know that the state screws everything up and makes it worse and less efficient and more costly. And in some cases, it really messes things up, like war. But even in its mundane tasks, like filling potholes, okay, the pothole got filled. There was a hole there before, but it could have been filled better, faster, cheaper. We know this. And we know this with respect to courts and law. We know this with respect to security and police. We know this with respect even to so-called national defense. We know this. Okay. But we don't have a lot of historical examples to push on people. We're presenting them with theory, and it's hard to sell theory because people are fearful, and fear and security always wins out. And this is one reason that I think libertarians ought to talk about this more. Hoppe stresses this in his little pamphlet called "What Must Be Done." Any of your listeners, I can get you. I'll send you 10 of these pamphlets. I'll send you a box of them. Because we got lots of them made. It's actually from a speech which Hoppe gave back in the 90s. I want to say 98, if memory serves. And it reads just as well today. And one of the things he says, nothing proceeds until you've got basic order in the streets. So libertarians don't want to hear this. They don't want to hear about cops and petty criminals and all that. So, but when you have the situation you've got in Seattle or San Francisco, for example, where district attorneys and the legislatures have decided not to prosecute property crimes below a certain amount. And so you literally have organized gangs of thieves going into CVS with big trash bags and filling up with $900 worth of cosmetics or whatever, and then going out and selling those on the street or on eBay or something. That's not the kind of thing that's going to get people all warm and fuzzy towards Cato's latest criminal justice reform paper, right? That's the kind of thing that makes people move to the suburbs, rightfully so. And at some point, that suburb, everyone's a right winger when it comes to what they know best, right? Isn't that one of Conquest's rules as well? So when it comes to your own suburb, what's the little island Bill Gates lives on? Is it Bellhaven Island or something? It's sort of across Puget Sound from Seattle. I'm going to suspect that there's a healthy degree of private security and perhaps even gates for which you have to enter a code or know the guy and live in there to enter. So, there's not, I disagree with this idea that there's an inherent conflict between order and liberty. I don't think that's actually true. I think, low-life criminals are illiberal by definition.
God, I love this.
Right? I mean, they're breaking every norm. We all understand theft. The kindergartners understand theft. They got their little eraser or something, So, I think that libertarians ought to talk more about police and cops and insurance and security and privatizing this because fear works, and it works better than pie in the sky utopia as a sales pitch.
With you saying this, I wanted to thank you publicly. I'm sure I posted it somewhere at the time, but back over this past summer, you were, I'm looking out my window here, my whole neighborhood was damn near on fire, and I was looking.
Is this Los Angeles?
No, I'm in North Carolina.
Oh, North Carolina. Oh,
yeah,
okay.
but yeah, my block got just absolutely demolished over the summer. And I was looking around to hear what, different libertarian voices had to say. And there wasn't but a handful of them, especially early on. Like you said, that a lot of libertarians were kind of shying away from that topic. But you were one of the people that came out very early and kind of spoke out against the property crime. And it was a short list of people. It was like you and Tom Woods and Dave Smith. And then it really trickled. Eric July kind of trickles down from there. But that is something that that a lot of people are sort of allergic to, talking about, that level of infringement upon your liberties, because there was not a lot of liberty during that period of time on my block. It was a very dangerous place to be. There wasn't a whole lot of freedom. So, and I was wondering, you were kind of observing like a general decline. You're talking about, very few of us are greater than our grandparents. And given what Matthew was talking about in terms of just the way that things are always pulled left, do you like, would you go as far to say that leftism is like sort of an entropic force, or is that just sort of a subjective opinion?
I don't know. We certainly we clamor for security. We know that. Most people think security can be provided only by government. We know that. So you take those two things, and then from security, you sort of go out in concentric circles and saying, well, security, but yes, we need food. We can't have people starving. We need Social Security. We can't have little old ladies thrown out on the street, which was the argument behind Social Security, by the way. So you can see how something for nothing is always going to have a very seductive appeal to people. It's just human nature. And you can also see how we need something in our lives. On some level, individualism is bunk. We need something in our lives, and the few people who truly march to the beat of their own drummer and are these total iconoclastic individuals are few and far between. And most people, if it's not family, if it's not God, if it's not tradition, if it's not some maniacal focus on their work like Elon Musk, if it's not some passion, hobby, animals, whatever it is, it's going to be something. And for a lot of empty, broken people, especially in their 20s and 30s, it's Bernie or AOC or climate change or Antifa. So once this becomes part of your psychological makeup, then it makes perfect sense to view the deplorables in almost movie-like caricature, right? I mean, these are people who stand between you and your entire sense of the world. And so people react to that very badly psychologically. Once you have a wholly political worldview, then any little political setback, like Hillary losing to Trump, was just a psychologically enormous event for millions of Americans. It could not compute with them. That just wasn't possible. I mean, she was the anointed, the progressive arc of history. There was going to be a woman president, and it was going to be Hillary. No one more qualified. So when that didn't happen, I think there was so much sand between the gears in their brains that the only way to deal with that psychologically was say, well, Russia, well, electoral college, well, disinformation, right? There's no way to just say, wow, Hillary's kind of an unlikable person, and people were kind of sick of this stuff, and so they voted for this crazy reality show orange guy. I mean, that's a pretty significant refutation of your candidate and your worldview. You didn't just lose to Jeb Bush or something, or $1 zillion Coke recipient Walker. Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin, right?
Right.
I mean, you lost to Orange Man,
Mm-hmm.
and that was one of the most beautiful moments in the history of U.S. politics. Yeah, I mean, it was absolutely. I mean, it was like a Fellini movie, right? It was like a sunset. and for libertarians to sit there and act as well, he's bad too. This isn't just because he's not Hillary. I mean, shut up, you morons. I mean, this guy rolled a hand grenade into the room. Okay. And he's not a deep state plant. He's not some brilliant guy. He just caught him by surprise. They were, of course, pleased when Trump became the nominee because they thought he was going to be easily defeated. So he just took everybody by surprise. He was a populist outsider in a legitimate sense. So when he upset the apple cart, this idea that something that out of left field could happen in American politics, given the duopoly and da-da-da, he won as a third-party candidate. Donald Trump was a third-party candidate. Now, he may have had R next to his name on the ballots. I get that. But he had zero support from his own party. In fact, he had active hostility and antagonism from much of his own party working against him at the precinct level. He had no ground game. He did not use the GOP machine to win. He was, in effect, a third-party candidate who won. He was Ross Perot 2.0, let's say. And the fact that libertarians couldn't even cheer that in the slightest, not necessarily that they agreed with Trump or his policies. Presidents don't have policies, come on. Mm-hmm. But that he showed what could be done from a populist perspective, that really shows you the hollowness of libertarianism, I believe.
And then after that, what blew my mind even more was after the election was fortified recently, that it seemed more appealing for a lot of libertarians to take what seemed like a kind of a golden opportunity to have some common ground. That look, this whole thing is fortified. That this whole process isn't what you think. There's fortification of these elections that can happen, and instead of trying to build coalition, like a lot of people always say, it's just they kind of. And the ones that I tend to see anyway, kind of move towards just sort of making fun of Trump supporters. And that seemed like such a missed opportunity. I don't know if you delve into hypotheticals at all. Do you think that if the election went another way, if just as Biden very legitimately won this election, just on the other side of the coin flip, if Trump happened to win the election very legitimately and was in office, do you think that the world would be more pleasant right now? Do you think it would have kicked the resistance into a higher gear? Do you have any? Have you ever gone down that road, thought experiment wise?
Well, I think Trump is much better off having lost because he would have inherited the continuing hellish fallout from COVID. From a supply chain perspective, he would have inherited that continuing hellish fallout from the fiscal and monetary policy. Just gross, egregious malfeasance by Congress and the Fed. So, he's better off not being hanged with this reality, because Biden's not really that responsible for what we're facing right now. He inherited it. So I think Trump is certainly better off. And I do recall in 2016 on election night, my wife and I had planned, we thought maybe we'd watch for a little bit and then probably go off to bed, but thinking that we would have had an answer pretty early in the night. But then when we didn't, and then when things started, you started to get that deer in the headlights look on MSNBC and such. I remember they went to they had a live shot of the hotel suite where Trump and his family and a few other people were watching. And I remember seeing Melania, and you could tell that she had just seen a ghost. It was starting to dawn on her what the hell they had gotten into, and her probably perfect life in New York City, right? Prior to that, as a rich socialite or whatever. And I really think that she was surprised. And so with that, I think Trump's better off. I think, would we be better off? I don't know. It's very, very hard to say. But your point about libertarians not reaching out to Trump voters, about libertarians not wanting to comment on the vitamin D fortified election or anything like that, it shows you that, first of all, libertarians share the same contempt that the left shares for deplorables. But moreover, this idea, the sanctity of elections, he tried to overturn an election. Good. Or they stormed the Capitol, the seat of our democracy. When you hear libertarians simping for the Capitol building, that's a little much. You guys aren't old enough, but you might remember Bad Brains? You had an album cover way back in the day that had a lightning bolt hitting the top of the Capitol dome. Yeah. And let's just say Bad Brains meant it more than libertarians meant it, apparently.
Oof. This is better than I was hoping for.
I had one of the big realizations for me with a lot of this is I kind of started having my fortifications challenged, ideologically speaking, was the recognizing that contempt, that because I come from a more conservative background. I have a lot of friends and family members who are Trump supporters, and they're Trump supporters because they see him as like a life raft in an ocean of a culture that just has complete contempt for them. And I have that sympathy. I have that kind of always in the back of my mind. And I get my Facebook reminders of the stuff I've posted over the last few years. And it's a bad idea to ever read those things because I have a lot of the, the whole, both sides are equally bad and Trump is an incompetent nincompoop and all that kind of thing. I have all those, and I come back through and I just I see myself now that I totally didn't even have any awareness of this extra level of the deeper functionings of society or something like that. And it's that profound lack of empathy in libertarians when they talk about we need to have better messaging or something like that. Invariably, it's all we need to talk about all of our favorite things, but louder. And I work with Jason Stapleton, and from a marketing perspective, he talks about how you need to enter the conversation people are already having in their minds. You can't approach them trying to force them to care about something you care about. You have to find the thing they care about, make common ground with them on that, and then you can influence them in your direction or wherever you're trying to take them. So it's that lack of empathy that you highlighted, that that really stood out to me. And then when people tried to say, oh, well, elections don't matter at all, and I watch Florida, and living in California with Gavin Newsom, having come from Washington with Jay Inslee, watching Florida and imagining what it would have looked like under Andrew Gillum, and what the rest of because of this the stake that Ron DeSantis has been able to plant where he is, that's affected the rest of national politics. Just him being there, one single election has just like absolutely massive impact. So I can't reconcile this idea then that, well, politics is all, all the parties are all the same and it doesn't matter, two wings of the same bird, yada yada yada. I just see this profound asymmetry, and ultimately that empathy is what has drawn me to start trying to go deeper or look out further, I guess. I guess I don't really have a question in there, but those are thoughts that were sparked by what you were saying. You have anything else, Stephen?
It seemed like Jeff was going to say something, in which case, go ahead.
Well, politics is tough for me. I don't follow it that closely. I know Tho's a lot more up on DeSantis and more pro DeSantis maybe than I am, but it absolutely mattered the last 18 months if you were in Florida versus if you were in Australia. Mattered a lot. Mm-hmm. So we can't discount that. And I do think that politics is tribal, and you vote for the person who's on your side or on your team, and you dismiss a lot of their faults, and you exaggerate a lot of their good points. I mean, that's the nature of it. It's sort of like your own family member or something. So all you needed to vote for Trump was to know that Hillary Clinton hates your guts. Okay, are we able to say that it's reasonable for someone to, I'm going to vote for the person who doesn't hate my guts on sight, right? I mean, and the thing about Trump, is even with his suit and that red tie and everything, I mean, Donald Trump has this. Bill Clinton had this. You could take either one of those guys. Bill Clinton before he went vegan and had heart surgery. Now he's a shadow of himself, and I'm convinced a lot of that's from going vegan. But also he had elective heart surgery, which was a huge mistake. You never at that age go under a general if you can help it. He should have just lost weight and dealt with it. And but anyway, going vegan now, he looks like a skeleton. He's pale. The old Bill Clinton with his political skills, he would have gotten Hillary across the finish line in 2008. Come on. That guy was a master. Okay. But here's the thing. You could take Bill Clinton or you could take Donald Trump. And you could drop either one of them in a biker bar in Alaska, and they'd be fine. 5 minutes later, they'd be buying rounds.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm. You take Hillary Clinton or Mitt Romney and drop them in a biker bar in Alaska, right? So that's the difference. That's the difference. And so, why shouldn't people vote for Trump if Hillary Clinton hates their guts? I mean, and if you want to say, well, the parties are the same and elections don't matter and this and that, oh, okay, but that's not how a lot of people see it. We grew up thinking, oh my gosh, President Kennedy was shot. I mean, this is like a figurehead. So I certainly don't like the politicization of everything. It wears me out. But I mean, for most people, they really do see the president as sort of the boss of the country or something. I mean, this idea. I mean, the thing that Trump did, which was truly fascist, after all this, calling him a racist and a white supremacist, the one thing he did, which was actually kind of fascist, was at the very end of his term, he fast-tracked an experimental vaccine with 3 or 4 monopoly patent-protected, pharmaceutical companies for purchase by the federal government to then impose on U.S. citizens, apparently, right? I mean, that's fascist. Obamacare forcing you to go out and engage with ostensibly private companies and have an insurance policy or face a fine. That's fascist. George W. Bush Patriot Act. Medicare Part D, that's fascist. Okay, but this idea that Trump was somehow uniquely more authoritarian or fascist than Obama's or Clinton's or Bush's is just absurd. It's just false. And libertarians went along with that. They signal boosted that. They did everything they could. These are not people who simply preferred Bill Weld to Ron Paul. Okay, these are people who prefer Hillary Clinton to Ron Paul.
Oof.
Let's not kid ourselves. Okay, that's the truth, because their conception of libertarianism is a globalist worldview with one size fits all. Social democracy for the whole world, no exceptions, no ifs, ands, or buts. We can't have, libertarianism is universalism, when in fact it's the opposite. It's common law universalism, as localized as possible. We know that. So there's a lot of real problems here. But why would we expect the libertarian world to escape the same right-left pressures that infect everything else? I mean, it was just natural. It's natural. Here's the difference. If someone says to me, oh, those guys down in the Mises Institute, they're right libertarians, they're right wingers. Okay. Doesn't bother me. But if you tell a Cato person who's going on and on at length about, something, and you say, well, you're a left libertarian, they'll fight you tooth and nail. No, I'm a doctrinaire libertarian. So this idea that we're not sort of naturally inclined to a reflexive, very loosely right or left worldview is false for the majority of people. Most people are wired a little bit one way or the other, if not a lot one way or the other.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And in the people who tend to be wired more towards being inclined towards right-leaning things, I think one of the big dividing marks has always been Hoppe. And so you referenced what must be done. And we were talking about politics here. For smaller area political solutions, do you see utility in that kind of going forward? With kind of moving to these more rural areas and trying to take over, governments at the local level.
Yeah, I hope so. It's very, very tough, because if you think about it, most normal people, good people, just sort of want to worry about their lives. And so, but there are crazed progressives in every society who can't leave anything untouched, can't leave anything alone. And so these people will literally, for a decade, they will spend every Tuesday night at some local zoning meeting. They'll do that every Tuesday night for 10 years to talk about some viaduct in your town, right? And then they'll run for state house. They'll hang and just as like, oh, okay, you can be our state rep. I mean, just name ID. Who cares? Nobody wants to do that. It's probably unpaid in most states. Okay, then they hang around there for 10 years. And then they run for U.S. Congress for the area of their state house, district. And lo and behold, someone's retiring and they get in. And lo and behold, I mean, the people who just hang around and involve themselves in this grind are the ones who win. And you got to hand it to progressives, because oftentimes they have a very long-term worldview. This is, way after they're dead. You could have told feminists in the 1920s, hey, this is what the 2020s will look like. And they would have been smiling ear to ear, So it's very, very tough for people who think like me, who want life to revolve around things other than this idea of how we all deal with one another, this organizing principle of society. People like me who tend to be more, hey, society can organize itself. We can have voluntary interactions and this and that. We can have chosen institutions rather than imposed. We tend to be not as busy and not as relentless as the people with the other worldview. And so that's why they win, I guess. But I do agree certainly with the idea of some sort of geographic concentration. I'm not sure that there's any other way out of this mess we've got ourselves in the United States, because if what we see on Twitter represents, if what we see on, let's say, left Twitter represents even a quarter, a third of the country, then we got a real problem. And I don't know how we get out of that without separating ourselves geographically at least a little bit. And that's very tough to do because it tends to be urban, rural in every state, right? It's not distributed evenly across the country like the Mason-Dixon line or something. So I wish I had better ideas on this.
That reality, the fact that you have those people that take the Bernie Sanders career arc that you described there, they inevitably they're the ones who are responsible for the fact that every institution eventually turns left. Those are your Burnham's manager type. Those are the people that will just infect any institution and they'll take it over and they'll wrestle control of it. There's another law of politics. Pornell's iron law of bureaucracy, which states that in any organization there will inevitably be two different types of people: the people who work for the institution's stated goals and the people who work for the institution itself. And the law states that inevitably the latter group will take over and take control of it. This was something that basically kind of broke me of my my intellectual inclination toward anarchism, because I recognize that this type of person, this sort of psychology being present in the society, means that even if you could accomplish the goal of reducing the state all the way to where it's eliminated and sufficient numbers of the population voluntarily opt out of it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, you're going to have some kind of institution that just exists to ensure that those types of people don't take over every institution. That and that sort of institution is inevitably going to wind up being a government. It's just an innate part of the society because you have those types of people. So then we have our friend Andrew. He goes by Popular Liberty online, and he started a caucus, the GOP Mises Caucus, specifically so that he could start pursuing some of these local races for this self-defense purpose, to try to take control of our local communities and just keep these people out. The people who want to take over every institution and impose those institutions on us, we're just going to keep them out of their hands because people don't pay attention to local politics at all. And he's got a pretty genius little piece of legislation he's come up with called the anti-tax. That's a means of using a sovereign wealth fund to basically privatize taxation. So it'll be interesting to see what he does with that. But I guess this gets back to what you were saying at the beginning about ultimately liberty cannot be the full basis of your worldview. It's an appendage that you incorporate into the rest of it. Ultimately, liberty is a means, or liberty is not an end, it's a means to the end. So you have to have that end first. So, liberty to do what? Liberty for what? And whatever that what is will ultimately be the thing that binds together a society. That's the thing that holds it together. Do you have any other thoughts on that, or should I wrap up here?
I mean, I agree with that. It's a means, and it's not an ends. I think that any decent society worth living in is going to have a degree, a reasonable degree of political and economic freedom. I mean, absent that, you're going to be poor. When you're poor, that's when people are at each other's throats even more than they are. So, I think a certain degree of liberal society is required for any kind of happiness. So you can worry about your kid's soccer game or whatever, the things you should be worrying about, rather than whether Trump is going to be the next president. I mean, that ought to be a far away worry for most people. But that said, I do like that idea that it's a means, right? I mean, what we want is for people to be peaceable and not have conflict and be more or less free to go about their own lives in hopefully a world with a reasonable technological and material level of sustenance. So we have good hospitals and dentists and all that stuff. So that's, and none of this would be difficult. If we'd had a government that was just reasonably sound throughout the 20th century, the United States would have walked away from the rest of the world. I mean, these are huge self-inflicted wounds as far as I'm concerned.
Absolutely. Well, we really appreciate you stopping in here. You've given us more time than we talked about, so I appreciate that. This was great. The chat here, it's just been our supporting listeners, and the chat here has been just absolutely eating up everything that you've been saying. So we are definitely fellow travelers. Do you
Okay,
have
well
any?
let me know when the YouTube is a YouTube.
Sounds good. Well, do you have any plugs or anything that you want to make?
No, follow me on Twitter. I can always use more Twitter followers, and go to Mises.org if you're deficient in your reading. We got plenty of content.
Sounds good. Thank you, guys.
All right,
We'll see you
thank you,
later.
guys.